Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, we've been doing these programs during the lockdown, and we've been doing them for a particular purpose, which is in the unusual circumstances of COVID-19, one thinks one can perhaps help people get through this difficult time by talking about issues which are relevant to their lives, relevant to South Africa, and relevant to the future. And it's with great delight today that we have on the program judges, we will be a judge one day, but at the moment, Adv Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who is Silk from the Johannesburg Bar, one of our most distinguished advocates, and also something that I will want to talk to him a little bit about, a fabulous book, The Land Desires, which you haven't read it, you've got time, you should read it now. Tembeka, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Pleasure. I wanted to ask you, I mean, you think a lot about these things. What is this? How do you see the state of our constitutional health? You know, there are lots of people suggesting, for example, because of COVID-19, securocrats have taken control and there's all sorts of, as it were, undemocratic things happening. I'm just curious, as somebody who practices regularly in these courts, constitutional courts, etc., what's your take?
Yes, I think sometimes, obviously, you know, if you are living in a moment, there is a tendency to exaggerate the degree of the problem. I don't think the fundamentals of the constitutional system themselves are at risk. COVID obviously provides a platform to test those fundamentals and their durability. But I do think that the rule of law itself has been challenged to an extent. I suppose, if anything we have to take from it, it is the extent to which we have to be a little bit humble. So there is probably a sense of humility to rule of law fundamentalists like me, that the gap between the rule of law and the police state isn't as big as we always assumed to be. We are probably 1 or 2 steps away from slipping over into a proper police state.
You see, that particular point that you make, I mean, let me just take one, for instance, Colin Skoza. When I looked at what happened to him, and it's not irrelevant in the light of what happened to George Floyd, and the South African Defence Force's seeming whitewash of the whole thing, my mind went back to, you know, our history and what police did in our history, and I wondered, is this just a bad dream, or what is going on here? And why is it always that poor people who happen always to be black are the ones who, in a sense, get the receiving end of repressive measures? I mean, this is terribly disturbing to me.
Yes. You see, Dennis, we have to look at this thing in historical terms. The police culture in this country, and as well as the military culture, is a combination of probably 3 cultures. The one is the Bantustan culture. The other is the apartheid mainstream culture. And the third is the exile culture, where people were trained in the army. None of those cultures were infused with the democratic ethos. And when they combined in 1994, what they produced was the same sort of autocratic, repressive cultures of policing. And the big task of the democratic state was to infuse democratic values into policing. And the same with the military. The transformation of the army has been a long, slow, resistant process. We have not yet gotten to a stage where the army and the police have embedded within their practices the cultures envisaged in the constitution. The one most drastic illustration of the problem is Marikana, where in one day, 24 people were gunned down by the police. And you would recall the report and the evidence that emerged from the report, which made the precise point that at the time, of course, it was 21 years, that 21 years into democracy, the democratic practices and the respect of human rights that should now be infused in the policing sector have not been infused, and certain recommendations were made. Sadly, those recommendations were never carried through. But also, Dennis, quite apart from the sort of below-up view of the policing and military culture, we have a political culture as well. Although we all aspire to the sort of heights that Nelson Mandela probably represented, the fact is that there has been a slide in the political culture. Politicians do not see themselves as embodiments of the constitutional system. They actually view the Constitution with suspicion that it restrains them too much and it does not enable them to govern. And the kind of resistance to the Constitution is manifested, for instance, in the pronouncements made by someone like Ngcukaitobi, who at the time of Marikana used to make this. At the time he was the general of the SAPS. But as the general of the SAPS, the pronouncements that he made shoot to kill. And now as the minister, the pronouncements that he made push a little bit, even if it means trampling upon rights. So there is also a problem of a political culture that seems resistant to the Constitution. And there's a third problem, which is a decline in civil society activity that is driven by a rights culture. In the early period of the Constitution, organizations like the Lawyers for Human Rights, the Legal Resources Center, Wits Law Clinic, were very strong organizations and very influential in society. The reality is that there has been a decline in that sort of civil society activism that anchors human rights culture. And that in the Zuma years, most human rights organizations tended to shift their focus from human rights concerns into accountability concerns. And so what we have now is, in a sense, a constellation, a combination of these factors that ultimately drag down the constitutional promise.
Can I ask you on that? Because it's really interesting. You mentioned organizations, and I accept them. And I don't want to be accused of being an opportunist here, but I mean, I've said this before. They were predominantly white organizations. I mean, Lawyers for Human Rights, etc. And what I'm curious about, I mean, and there are many black organizations that were involved. And obviously, having spent my life in the trade union movement advising in the old days, I'm well aware of that. But I'm worried that we haven't been able to build a kind of a non-racial, if I could call it, non-governmental organizational sector. Am I wrong? I mean, are we, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but I'm just curious, are we moving in a direction? I mean, is part of the problem that we sort of are so divided that we can't actually come together?
Yes, that is true. I mean, your factual observation that the so-called human rights organizations tend to be dominated by white men is true. But obviously, we must acknowledge that things are changing. Take your own organization, the Center for Applied Legal Studies. Dr. Tsepo Madlingozi is today the director, and he is doing a fantastic job. Yeah. And the attorneys in that organization are also, some of them, black women, and they are doing a marvelous job. So it's not as if the picture is either white or black. Things are moving in a direction, hopefully a positive direction. But your overall point is still right, that the organizations that pursue questions of the rule of law and human rights are predominantly run by white men. And the problem with that is that there is an old problem of legitimacy of the Constitution, and a problem in terms of which, how do you make the Constitution a popular document? Because unless the people speaking in favor of the Constitution look like those people who must be protected by the Constitution, there is a legitimacy gap. This is obviously one of the concerns that I have about the historical origins of the Constitution and trying to embed that history in popular struggles. And so on the issue of organizations, it is true that there has to be massive transformation from many human rights organizations. But that shouldn't stop those of us who are not in formal structures, me as one of the examples and many other colleagues of mine, who are Black and who feel that the Constitution should also speak to Black people's aspirations, from making the point that in order for the Constitution to be meaningful, it needs to be anchored in popular struggles. It has always, incidentally, Dennis, it has always been anchored in popular struggles. It is a matter of recent origin that there is constitutional skepticism about whether or not this is a Eurocentric document or not. If you were in this country in 1911 or in this country in 1913, the language of equality was a language of revolution. And yet today, because it is contained in a piece of paper, we are even suspicious of the language of equality, and we have forgotten about its revolutionary sources.
But you see, it can be revolutionary. It certainly can be radically transformative. But I wonder whether part of the problem is, coming back to some of the earlier points that you made, if you've got a police culture, which to a large degree is, as you indicated, if you've got non-delivery, and COVID-19 has shown this better than almost anything else in a magnifying glass, it's shown if you're in a township and you're poor, you get a really terrible time of it. If you're in a middle-class area like me, it's unpleasant, but I can survive, hopefully, the pandemic much easier. What I'm trying to say is there's been a disconnect between the aspects, and surely that means something's got to give.
Yes. I suppose, I mean, there are 2 points to be made. The one is, might I mention, the one is the class problem, which is how does one address...
You can always mention that.
Yes. So the one is the class problem that mutates in different forms, but it's resistant to change. Then the second is the constitutional problem, which is how does one use the constitution in order to resolve the class problem? Now, if we are there in relation to that question, I mean, what COVID has illustrated is that if we needed any reminders, it has illustrated that if you're Black and poor and you live in a township, you will have no access to healthcare. And one of the things I'm curious about is whether or not we will get racial breakdowns of the COVID deaths. But what it has also illustrated, and this is where poor people find themselves, in a sense, caught in between two conflicting impulses. Because on the one hand, there is a push to reopen the economy. Let's reopen the economy. It's doing too much damage to keep the lockdown. But on the other hand, there is the pushback, which is the extreme version, sort of Soviet-style regimentation of society, which is pursued by some people in government. But in between those two extremes, the open-ended, let's open the economy, as well as the command system, in between them are poor people. And the problem with living poor people in between is that most of them are unable to look after themselves without state support. But at the same time, they need the economy in order to survive. So what should a constitutionalist or what should a human rights lawyer do in those circumstances? So the one thing I have proposed is, in relation to the measures taken, is a need for proportionality and a need for rationality. But the other point is that this is probably the time for radical changes, which are permitted by the Constitution. One example I made is that everybody accepts today that the fact that many poor Black people live in compressed environments, Alex, Soweto, everywhere you go, is probably the type of justification one needs for a radical land reform program, which the Constitution envisages. So rather than the Constitution being an instrument to stop the government from acting, it could also be an instrument to spur them into action.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I too have banged on for some while now about the disgrace of our urban areas, like the apartheid urban areas, in terms of the racial demography. And you're right, that's exactly what's happened. COVID-19 has shown this. You can't have a lockdown in circumstances where people are tricked by jobs. So strange enough, it's come back to hurt us. And I'm curious, I mean, the government and other political parties have taken the view, well, the Constitution's to blame, we changed Section 25. But you know, and I know, that we can change as much as we like. That doesn't lift land reform unaided into implementation. So what's going on here? Why is it that we've struggled so hard to be able to make these kinds of changes 26 years into democracy?
Yes. Now, what the Constitution envisaged at the time of its adoption was a transformed society. But in order to transform society, you needed to transform government. In other words, you needed to transform the state, the instrument that you will be using to transform society. Now, transforming the state has proven to be an impossible job, because the more the state seeks to transform, is the more it repeats the state of apartheid. So take three features of the apartheid state, which have multiplied under the democratic state. One is corruption. The unique feature of the apartheid state was massive corruption. Secondly is over-bureaucratization. The unique feature of the apartheid state was over-bureaucratization. And even though there is a claim of Batupile, people first, the reality is that that principle has not been transformed into reality. And then the third element is disrespect for human rights. Although the government claims to respect human rights, its actual practice is not reflective of its respect for human rights, because it has not internalized questions about who is responsible for job creation, who is responsible for building of houses, who is responsible for issues of access to water. So on those three questions that we cannot judge the apartheid state of, what we find is that some of those have simply been transformed, or transferred rather, into the democratic state. So until we are able to transform the state itself so that it can be an instrument for transforming society, what we will find is that this gap between the aspirations of the Constitution and its text will perpetuate to the next 25 years.
Time is running out now, surely. I mean, we get out of this COVID-19, time is not think from a looking forward, that we've got hope that that's what you're talking about could happen.
Yes. So some people argue that what you need is a sort of an uprising, a revolution. Other people argue that what you need is a change in government. But I think what you need is a change in culture of the administration. So what we need is individuals who are committed to the project of constitutionalism to take over the running of the state. What we need is institutions to be strengthened. For the most part, we have spoken about the necessity for a human rights culture to be embedded in the ways in which we do things. But it's become clear that unless the institutions themselves are strengthened, unless the institutions themselves are transformed, it will be almost an impossible job to work around the implementation of the Constitution. The one clearest example has been the Public Protector Office.
Yeah, sure.
At some point, no one knew about the office. And at its height, it was run by Advocate Donsel. Today, many people think that that office has become a political football. But what that shows is the necessity of matching institutions with individuals who are actually committed to the project of the Constitution.
I wanted just to ask you finally, because I'm running out of time. Do you think that in this situation, we're relying too much on the judiciary? That in a sense, we use the judiciary to bail us out?
No, I think most of the constitutional work, Dennis, is actually done outside of the judiciary. Most of the constitutional work is done at the executive level, at municipalities and in parliament. That's where internal policies are adopted, which are designed to implement the Constitution. And the same as in parliament, where there is a translation, or at least an attempt at translating the broad constitutional principles into legislation. Very few of the issues that concern the executive and the judiciary ultimately make their way to court. And even when they do, very few actually succeed as constitutional challenges. So the role of the judiciary is still an important role, but we must always remember that it's the backdrop role as opposed to the front role. The front role is still taken by the executive. It's still the legislature that comes after the executive. And the judiciary always comes last we always go to courts when we cannot get what we want from the executive.
I agree with you. I'm afraid I've run out of time, which is a terrible thing. It's a really important point. You raised a whole range of important points. We've got to get you back to do another program on this. But Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, thank you very, very much for what has been a very insightful conversation. And as with everybody else,